నమస్కారం. ఇది సంగతికి స్వాగతం. ప్రపంచ ఆర్థిక వ్యవస్థకు అమెరికా ఫెడరల్ రిజర్వ్ రష్యాల నుంచి ప్రమాదం పొంచి ఉందని ఆర్థిక శాస్త్రంలో నోబెల్ అవార్డు గ్రహీత ప్రముఖ ఆర్థిక శాస్త్రవేత్త ప్రొఫెసర్ జోసెఫ్ స్టిగ్లిట్జ్ అభిప్రాయపడ్డారు. మూడో ప్రమాదం చైనా నుంచి ఉందని తెలిపారు. ద్రవ్యోల్బణాన్ని తగ్గించే పేరుతో కేంద్ర బ్యాంకులు వడ్డీ రేట్లు పెంచడం వల్ల నిరుద్యోగ సమస్య మరింత పెరిగే అవకాశం ఉందని హెచ్చరించారు. భారతదేశంలో ఆర్థికాభివృద్ధికి సమ్మిళిత అభివృద్ధి ముఖ్యమని అభిప్రాయపడ్డారు. 21వ శతాబ్దంలో ఆర్థికాభివృద్ధిలో ఆవిష్కరణలది కీలక పాత్ర అని, ఇలాంటి కొత్త ఆలోచనలు విశ్వవిద్యాలయాల నుంచే వస్తాయని అన్నారు. అయితే ఇలాంటి విశ్వవిద్యాలయాలపై దాడి మంచిది కాదని హితవు పలికారు. ప్రపంచాన్ని మరో ఆర్థిక సంక్షోభం చుట్టుముట్టనుందని ప్రచారం జరుగుతున్న నేపథ్యంలో ఈనాడు ఈటీవీకి ఇచ్చిన ఇంటర్వ్యూలో ఆయన పలు అంశాలను పంచుకున్నారు.
ప్రపంచంలో ఆర్థిక సంక్షోభం తీవ్రరూపం దాల్చుతుంది. ద్రవ్యోల్బణం పెరిగి ధరలు విపరీతంగా పెరుగుతున్నాయి. ప్రపంచం మరో భారీ ఆర్థిక మాంద్యాన్ని చవిచూసేందుకు ఎదురు చూస్తుంది. మరోపక్క నిరుద్యోగ సమస్య తీవ్రం దాలుస్తుంది. ప్రపంచం ఎదుర్కొంటున్న ఆర్థిక సమస్యలు, ఆర్థిక సంక్షోభం గురించి మనతో చర్చించడానికి నోబెల్ అవార్డు గ్రహీత, కొలంబియా విశ్వవిద్యాలయం ఆర్థిక శాస్త్ర ప్రొఫెసర్, ప్రపంచంలోనే గుర్తింపు పొందిన ఆర్థికవేత్త ప్రొఫెసర్ జోసెఫ్ స్టిగ్లిట్జ్ మనతో ఉన్నారు. ఈనాడు ఈటీవీతో ప్రొఫెసర్ జోర్జ్ మాట్లాడబోతున్నారు. What are the main causes of the inflation, present inflation? What are the major challenges of global economy? Do you think it will recover from the COVID pandemic and Ukraine war?
The inflation is overwhelmingly caused by the supply side disruptions and the demand side dislocations, shifts in patterns of consumption caused by the pandemic and then caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We are addressing many of these. Price of cars and the shortage of cars has diminished significantly. The price of oil has come down from its peak, and this exerts a disinflationary pressure. So the medium term, of course, our challenge is to move away from dependence on fossil fuels, which are disproportionately controlled by autocratic. Fortunately, because of advances in technology, the cost of which will be, I think, lower. Obviously, the supply will be more reliable.
We hear reports that soon world is going to face another bout of recession. How do you perceive the present situation? Will the present economic crisis worsen in the coming years? Is it possible to preempt this? How does it impact the third world economies like India? Can India escape this?
Well, I think the major danger right now to the global economy is coming from the U.S. Federal Reserve on the one hand and from Russia on the other. The U.S. Federal Reserve seems to be mistaken in its conviction that the only way to address inflation is to raise interest rates to the point where there is what they call pain. And unfortunately, pain, what they mean is increasing unemployment, a global slowdown, is felt by marginalized people in the United States, low-income people in the United States. But the global slowdown will hurt countries all over the world. When I said that there are two risks, I should have said three. The first risk is the one I just described, the excessive zeal in the Federal Reserve and killing the global economy in the name of fighting inflation. Totally mistaken perspective. The second, of course, is the prolongation by Russia of the war in Ukraine, which risks disturbance, uncertainty, high energy prices, working with MBS in Saudi Arabia. Obviously, a major disturbance to the global economy. Can also hit food markets because of the importance of Ukraine and Russia to the global food market. The third risk is China. China's zero COVID policy has not worked very well, and exposed it to a heavy increase in the incidence of COVID-19 as it moves away from the zero COVID policy, particularly because it has not been open, in my mind, very foolishly, to the much more effective mRNA vaccines of
the governments and central banks in the USA and Europe continue to insist the raising interest rates is the only way to tame soaring prices. Do you think the over-reliance on rate increases will likely to lead economic disaster in a low and middle income countries?
Yeah, I think we have to understand the major blame lies with the Federal Reserve, because as it raises interest rates, other countries are forced to raise their interest rates. The economy in Europe is already very weak, and raising interest rates there will even weaken it further. So I am very worried that this misguided view that the only way to address inflation is by raising interest rates will cause a major global slowdown. There are other ways. In particular, in the United States, for instance, there are some who are worried about labor supply shortages. The obvious answer is to pass a law to provide child care for women that allows a much greater increase in this women participation in the labor force, change immigration policy, provide better family leave policy, sick leave policy. So there are a whole set of labor market policies that would make a difference. In the area of energy, clearly we ought to be working much more rapidly to increase the supply of renewable energy. And that would now reduce our dependence on oil, fossil fuels, and if we did it quickly enough, would bring down the price of. There are other things we could do that could bring on greater supplies of energy much more quickly. So these are examples of fiscal supply side measures. There's also evidence in the United States, and almost surely elsewhere, but I've only studied it in the United States, that market power, monopoly power, has played a role. The markups of corporations have increased enormously. They're taking advantage of the situation, more than passed on costs. Their profits are record levels. It's partly to do with the abnormality, the disturbances of the pandemic, the war. And I am hopeful that when things normalize, those markups will come down, and that too will be disinflationary. But in the meanwhile, we should undertake strong antitrust actions and tax policy that would encourage firms not to take advantage of their market power. We should have, for instance, a windfall profits tax, and those engaged in higher exploitation would face higher tax rates.
Many of the global giants, especially in the IT sector, have literally stopped new recruitments, and the existing employees too are under constant pressure of labor. Or all this is just a part of fear psychosis?
Well, I think it's more complicated than that. There is fear. The fear is associated with the ability of the IT giant to raise capital. Some of their ability to raise capital in recent years has been related to the very low and high liquidity policies of central banks. One of the concerns that I have is that the central banks have gone all of a sudden now they're stopping the flow, and that whipsaw is having a particularly big effect on the IT sector. So rightly worry that the startups won't be able to be brought to market at kinds of valuations that they had before. And that has had a very strong dampening effect on the IT sector.
So what is your view on current global challenges? Do you think we are in a process of creating global disaster How will you visualize a future role of institutions like the World Bank, IMF? Are they relevant now?
I think we're going through an extraordinarily difficult challenge because the framework since World War II, which was one many ways led by the United States to create a global economic order where borders did not matter or mattered less and less, has been upended. And it's very clear, beginning with President Trump and then the pandemic, that borders do matter. And that the rule book that we created in WTO, as imperfect as it was, has basically been torn up. And we don't have a new rule book to guide us through what might be viewed as a new Cold War between the United States, probably with Europe on its side, and China on the other, and probably Russia on China's side. It's not going to be like the old Cold War. We are too economically integrated over the last 33 years, but it will clearly not be a borderless world. And at the same time, we know that we have to cooperate. We have to cooperate addressing climate change and dealing with pandemics. And so we are in this real quandary. How do we fight what must be viewed as a new Cold War and still cooperate on the many issues that we need to cooperate on? And it will be a major source of discussion in coming years.
Sir, has neoliberalism reached a dead end? What course will it take now? Will the crisis in neoliberalism culminate into political crisis in developing countries?
I believe neoliberalism should have reached a dead end. Ideas to replace neoliberalism, but those issues are still part of the political discourse. If I look at what is happening in the United States, what I would say that we become ideologically rudderless. Always, of course, politics has never been driven by pure theory. But I think we are in a moment in which the sense of incoherentness, the disparities between practical policies.
So what are the lessons third world countries, particularly India, need to learn from Sri Lankan economic crisis?
Well, I think the lesson that India most importantly needs to learn is that you are not going to have successful economic growth if you don't, in the 21st century. It requires at least two things. First, have to have innovation requires good universities, and the attack of your government on universities is not a good thing. It will under inclusiveness to economic growth, a kind of solidarity to to the economy and society. The divisiveness of your government and excluding the attacks on Muslims and other groups, I think is being viewed around the world with a certain amount of horror. It is not likely that you will be able to sustain the kind of stability